Nobody expected this to happen to her. She was smart, successful. She'd read every book, sat through years of therapy, promised herself never again. And yet, 18 months later, she was standing in the exact same argument with a different name attached to it. Same silence after the fights, same excuses, same slow, quiet disappearance of herself. Psychologists have a name for this. Dating apps have a business model built on it, and in 2026, an entire industry, worth tens of billions of dollars, profits from the fact that most people will never break it. This isn't a story about bad luck, so Freud did something almost no scientist of his era was willing to do years ago by a doctor who wasn't even trying to explain love, he was trying to explain war. And by the end of this, you're going to look at every relationship you've ever had completely differently.
But I am always the one who has to do everything around here!
Well, you cannot even define what a normal standard is.
You never listen to me when I am trying to talk!
That is because you never make any sense at all!
In 1914, a doctor in Vienna started noticing something that made no sense. Soldiers were coming back from the trenches of World War I, and something strange was happening in their sleep. They weren't dreaming about victory. They weren't dreaming about home. Night after night, they were reliving the worst moment of their lives. The exact explosion, the exact scream, the exact second everything went wrong. That doctor was Sigmund Freud, and what he was watching broke every rule he'd built his entire career on. Freud believed the mind was driven by pleasure, that every choice, every dream, every hidden desire was the brain chasing something that felt good. But this wasn't pleasure, this was pain on repeat, by choice. He admitted his own theory couldn't explain it, and in trying to solve that one impossible contradiction, he stumbled onto a mechanism so powerful it doesn't just explain shell-shocked soldiers, it explains why brilliant, self-aware adults, a century later, keep walking back into relationships that are destroying them, and call it love. He called it repetition compulsion, and it might be the most expensive psychological blind spot in the modern economy. Before Freud, there was no framework for this at all. If you kept ending up in painful situations, the explanation was simple: bad luck, bad character, or bad choices. Freud proposed something radically different and honestly unsettling. He suggested the mind doesn't just remember trauma, it tries to replay it, searching unconsciously for a chance to finally get the ending right. Picture a locked room in the basement of the mind. Inside that room sits every unresolved wound: a father who left, a mother who withheld love, a first heartbreak that was never explained. The conscious mind believes the door is sealed shut, but Freud argued the door was never locked at all. It was propped open, and the mind kept walking back in, dressed in a disguise it didn't recognize. Here's the number that should stop you cold. Modern researchers studying attachment patterns have found that people are significantly more likely to select partners whose behavior mirrors an unresolved parental dynamic, not despite the resemblance, but because of it. The brain isn't malfunctioning when this happens. It's executing an old buried instruction with perfect precision. But this was only the beginning, because decades after Freud died, a British psychiatrist would take this idea, strip away the jargon, and turn it into something you could actually observe in real time in your own living room. Bowlby watched these children form desperate, specific patterns of attachment to whoever was available, even when that caregiver was inconsistent, cold, or unreliable. The children didn't attach to kindness. They attached to whatever pattern was familiar, because familiar felt safer than unknown, even when familiar was neglect. This became known as attachment theory, and it is now one of the most cited frameworks in psychological research on adult relationships worldwide. It didn't just explain childhood, it explained why grown adults, decades later, with every resource and every warning sign available to them, keep choosing partners who recreate the exact emotional temperature of their childhood home. Bowlby's successors mapped this into 4 attachment styles, and here is the part that built an entire industry on top of a psychological wound. An anxiously attached person and an avoidantly attached person don't just tolerate each other. They are statistically disproportionately drawn to each other, locked in a loop where one chases and one withdraws, each confirming the other's deepest fear over and over in a cycle that can last years. And once dating moved off the street corner and onto a screen, someone noticed this pattern wasn't just a psychological curiosity, it was a business opportunity. By the early 2020s, the online dating industry had grown into a market worth more than $8 billion a year, built almost entirely on one product: prediction. Matching algorithms don't ask what would be good for you, they ask what you will engage with. And here is the uncomfortable truth buried inside that distinction. The profile that reminds your nervous system of an old wound often generates more messages, more late-night conversations, more addictive uncertainty than the calm, secure, boring match sitting 2 rows down in the results. Behavioral researchers studying app engagement have repeatedly found the same pattern. Unpredictability increases attention. A partner who is warm one day and distant the next produces a stronger dopamine response than a partner who is reliably warm every day. In pure economic terms, that unpredictability is retention, and retention is revenue. This is the part almost nobody says out loud. An industry now worth tens of billions of dollars is not designed to help you find a secure, stable partner as efficiently as possible. It is designed to keep you swiping. And repetition compulsion, that century-old psychological blind spot Freud first documented in Shell-Shocked Soldiers, is one of the most reliable engines keeping people on these platforms for years, not weeks. But the story doesn't end at the algorithm, because even outside of apps, in the era of pure human choice, the pattern shows up with almost mathematical consistency. Family law economists in the United States have estimated the divorce industry, legal fees, custody proceedings, asset division, generates well over $50 billion annually. Multiple long-term studies tracking remarriage have found that second marriages fail at a higher rate than first marriages, and third marriages fail at a higher rate still. Read that again. The people most likely to fail again are the people who have already failed once and chose to try again with a completely different person. That statistic isn't about bad luck compounding, it's about an unexamined pattern. Walking into a new room, wearing a new face, and sitting down in the exact same chair. Therapists who specialize in relationship patterns describe this, using a phrase that has become common in modern practice. Same person, different outfit. The name changes, the job changes, the city changes, but the emotional architecture, the specific blend of unavailability, chaos, or coldness, stays remarkably consistent. Chosen again and again without the person ever consciously deciding to choose it. Which raises the question that has occupied researchers for the last 30 years. If this pattern is invisible to the very people living inside it, is there any way to actually break it? The counter-discovery. In 1978, psychologist Mary Ainsworth ran an experiment that would end up giving the world its first real proof that repetition compulsion isn't a life sentence. It was called the strange situation. A toddler, a mother, a stranger, and a series of separations and reunions, all observed from behind a one-way mirror. What Ainsworth discovered changed the field permanently. Attachment style wasn't fixed biology. It was a pattern learned early that could shift with new, consistently different experiences. Later, longitudinal studies tracking people over decades found something researchers now call earned secure attachment. Adults who started life with anxious or avoidant patterns, but through therapy, self-awareness, or a genuinely secure relationship, measurably shifted into secure functioning as adults. Which means the mechanism that built a $50 billion divorce industry and helped keep millions of people locked into an algorithm engineered around emotional unpredictability has a documented exit door. But almost nobody is told it exists. The uncomfortable truth is this. The person who feels like the one isn't always the person who is right for you. Sometimes they are simply the person whose flaws are shaped exactly like a wound you've been carrying since childhood, and your nervous system mistakes that recognition for destiny. Every industry in this story, dating apps worth billions, a divorce system worth tens of billions more, depends, at least in part, on people never being told this. Awareness is the one input that doesn't scale, doesn't monetize, and doesn't show up on a quarterly earnings call.